And did you notice they put stop signs at Old?
You telling me to move?
Not the Pleasant Valley Cemetery, it's the Hueneme Masonic Cemetery, but it's on Pleasant Valley Road.
All right, Frank, we'll take it over.
Okay. I grew up on my dad's property that was adjacent to the cemetery on the east side. And so from a very early age, I was aware of the cemetery. And in fact, there was a horse stables that was on the 2 acres that's in between the Japanese cemetery and the Masonic cemetery. And my sister and I used to go over there and hang out, and the stable owner used the cemetery as one of the trails that they could ride horses through, so they would circle around and drive and ride through the cemetery. I really, it was always overgrown from the time that I remember. It was neglected, and it started officially in 1898 when the Hueneme Masonic Cemetery Association became a legal entity, and it was called the Masonic Cemetery because in those years, all the businessmen and entrepreneur types and farmers even most of them were members of the Masonic Lodge. So the organizers were all Masons, and they chose the name of the Hueneme Masonic Cemetery. And why did they build it where it is? Okay, this is a map of what was called in the 1800s, late 1800s, the Hueneme Plains. Hueneme was the town here at because of the wharf that Tom Bard built. Camarillo was over in this area, and the closest cemetery to serve all the Oxnard Plain, because Oxnard was definitely not there. All this was just vacant land. And there was a cemetery over here at a place called Springville. And so when there was somebody needed to be buried out in this area, quite often the funeral was held at the home, and then they trekked all the way over here and all the way back, and it would take most of the day. It was quite a trip. And so members of the Masonic Lodge, namely Frank Pettit, who was a farmer, W.S. Saviers, who was also from the farming family, H. Levy, who was, I think, a cousin of A. Levy, the banker, and Mr. Koji, who was a druggist, and Tom Bard, of course, was. They were all members of the first board of directors. Tom Bard was a major financial backer. So they picked the spot right there. This is Pleasant Valley Road. Goes all the way over to Camarillo. This road right here is Edding Road. And right here at this intersection is where the cemetery was surveyed. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, this is a 1980s aerial view of the cemetery, and this is Pleasant Valley Road. This is Edding. This is the Masonic Cemetery as it was in 1980. The green is macaroni grass that was planted there after it was more or less abandoned in the, I think, sometime in the 1920s, late 20s.
Or ice plant.
Yeah, ice plant. So the cemetery was surveyed to go from this corner all the way up to about here, down to here, and over here. And this was the property that I grew up on. This was about 4.5 acres. And time, this house and barn is where I grew up, and then in about 1957, my folks built another home over here. Turn the page. Yeah. So this is the survey map that was dated, recorded in 1900 at the request of A. Lee, and it shows all the plots, and there's about 300 plots in here that were designated to be burial plots. The only part that was developed was 4 lanes. This lane, this lane, this lane, and this lane. Here was number 2 of it. So all this was never developed. In fact, when my dad bought adjoining property over in this area, I know he had to go to the county, to the courthouse, and get the burial plot designation removed. And I can remember going along with him. I was must have been about 4 years old. And it was kind of a scary thing. We went into this courthouse, and I'd never been to see a judge in black robes and sitting up there high. And oh my God, what is this, Judgment Day? You know, I'd been to church, and our minister wore a black robe, but I didn't know what this guy was all about. So this down here they call New Road. This was later it was named Edding Road, and this would be Old Road down here. Ocean View School would be over in this area. The plots were 20 by 20, and the entrance was off of Pleasant Valley was here, and this was 40 feet wide, and the entrance and exit down here off of Edding Road was 40 feet wide, and it had this large circular or rectangular area where wagons could pull in and go down the lanes, and these lanes were 30 feet wide, and this would be parking area for wagons and teams, and of course, I guess the hearse would go down to the plot, and so that was the plan of the cemetery, and it looks like they were going to have a other entrance here, but it never got done. They planted eucalyptus trees right here and around here and down Edding Road down to about here, and they're barely surviving. There's way, you know, they were planted in 1898, so they're getting tired. Some of them have fallen over. The cemetery was well received by the community, and they were happy to have one that was close by. And it was used for about 20 years. And then when Ivy Lawn Cemetery opened up, and they had care for the plot. This cemetery, the owners had to take care of their own plots. That's why it just got overgrown with weeds, and they drilled a small water well, and they had some water, but Ivy Lawn was much more advantageous. Take your loved ones over there. And in fact, my grandfather was buried, he died in 1905, my great-grandfather. That's his picture right there on the wall. And he died in 1905, and then my great-grandmother died in 1927, and so when she died, they disinterred my great-grandfather and moved him over to Ivy Lawn too. So let's go to the next slide. So this is another aerial, but this is more like in the 2000, 20 years after the previous aerial. And see, here's the Masonic. Members of the Demolay Society came out and got all excited for a couple of years, and they took up all the ice plant and cleaned it up real nice, but then it was just like it was in when the people had to take care of their own plots. Nobody took care of it, and it turned into another wheat patch and a fire hazard, and was set on fire a couple of times. So I was living here in this house at the time, and so I would take my tractor and starting in the springtime would go out and disc the weeds down outside of, these are the plots right here, and this would be a lane. This was the big turnaround area. Here's the entrance over here, and here's the entrance over on the Olds and Edding side. And so I would end up discing the weeds down 3-4 times a year and kind of keep it under control. And when I was doing this, I started becoming more familiar with the names on the tombstones and dates and stuff. And yeah, we can turn the page. Yeah, and this guy here was had a government marker, and I'll show it to you later. But and the government marker said Sergeant Hueneme Kenyon, 4th Michigan Cavalry, and Company L, 4th Michigan Cavalry. So I thought, wow, gotta be Civil War, I was thinking. And then I knew from reading history that General Custer, famous General Custer, the Little Bighorn, he was in the Michigan Cavalry. But so that really kind of sparked my interest, and I researched this Gurdon's records on the National Archives, and found out that this was the 4th Michigan and Custer was the 5th Michigan, so they didn't serve together, although they were from the same area of Michigan. And so I got a lot of information from him, and I ended up becoming friends with one of his great-great-granddaughter, and so he was a Civil War veteran. He volunteered in 1862 and served till the end of the war. He was part of General Sherman's March to the Sea, and he was injured, a non-combat injury in Marietta, Georgia, and because they were tearing down buildings to get lumber to build buildings that they wanted, and a big timber fell on him and crushed his chest, and he obviously recovered from it, because here he is, I think, after the war, I don't know, but it always affected him, and he lived with it, and he ended up coming to California, and he had 3 daughters, and one of the daughters married a guy by the name of George Hales, and Hales is a property owner off of Edding Road, about maybe 2 miles east of the cemetery. And in fact, there's a Hales Road that runs between Edding and Pleasant Valley. And so he ends up, he applied for a pension, and disability is what he applied for. And it took him 15 years to get this $8 a month pension. Because when he was injured, he wasn't part of his regular unit. He had been loaned out to another unit, and he was what they call TDY, temporary duty. And they didn't keep good records. And nobody could prove, he couldn't prove anything, really. So they just resisted. Finally, 15 years later, when he's pretty well decrepit by this time. He gets a pension, and he survives a couple more years, and then he dies. And I tell you, almost before the body's cold, they ceased the pension. The poor widow didn't get anything. So next page, please. No.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. There you go. So this is Gurdon and his wife, about 1874, in Los Angeles photo studio. Her name was Desdemona. Next. And this is Gurdon later in life. And this is the tombstone. You can barely make it out. It says Sergeant up here, Gurdon, Kenyon, Company L, 4th Michigan Cavalry. It's still there. So he dies in 1898, and that's just about the time the cemetery was getting started. So he's one of the first persons that was, no, not yet. Go back. Yeah, he's one of the first persons that was buried there, and his funeral was held at the Hales residence, about 2 miles east of the cemetery. And I want to read a couple of sentences from his obituary that states, a large company of his relatives, neighbors, and friends gathered to pay the last tribute of respect to one who was universally loved and respected by all who knew him. There were 50 teams in the procession, which followed his remains to the cemetery. Now that would be a sight I would like to see, these 50 teams coming, obviously probably came down Hales Road to Edding, and then came right down Edding and turned into the cemetery. I would just love to see that. It was his last request that his funeral sermon be preached by his pastor, after which his comrades of the Grand Army of the Republic should take charge of the remains, and that he be buried with military honors, all of which was carefully carried out. Thus another of our grand old veterans has been promoted, and a brother called home. Okay, next page. No? There. Okay. Now the second Civil War veteran that was buried, and he has an unmarked grave, but right up in the paper, in the Oxnard Courier, states that his interment was made in the Masonic Cemetery, and he died in 1917, natural causes, and he was in his 80s. And the very interesting thing about him was that he was injured during the Battle of Gettysburg on the 3rd day of battle, which was important because that was during the Pickett's Charge, all or nothing thrust to try to break through the Union line, which failed. And his unit, the 8th Volunteer Ohio, was, go to the next slide. Okay, this is the Union troops. The red is the Confederate troops. And this is the Union was behind a stone wall here. And this is Pickett. And he was commanded by Robert E. Lee to walk across this open field and get the hell shot out of them. And they made it to the wall, but they couldn't break through. And the 8th Volunteer Ohio was over here on the side, and they did a lot of damage, according to the history books, by when these guys were walking across right in front of them. And so towards the end of the day, his name was Henry Starr Porter. And towards the end of the day, he got shot in the elbow with a mini ball, and it just really messed up his arm. And he was able to get a discharge shortly thereafter, within 3 months or so, and he was out of the war at that point. He came. He went back home, and he moved his family to Kansas. He had 7 children and a number of boys. And so he moves to Kansas, and he does quite well there. He's a cattle rancher, and he has a couple of ranches. And then he decides to move to this area before the turn of the century. And he has property out on Wood Road in 5th Street, out by the Pleasant Valley Lamb Bean Warehouse. And he grows sugar beets for the factory. And then he dies in 1917, and of natural causes. And it's just amazing that a guy that was in the Battle of Gettysburg could die of natural causes out here in California and is buried in the cemetery.
Amazing.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah, it's unmarked because not everybody had a stone marker. There was I remember as a kid, there was a lot of wooden markers, and they just rotted away.
Do they know where his actual grave is?
No.
Can't be pinpointed.
No.
Too bad.
Frank, I recall seeing a lot of Japanese writing.
Well, at the Japanese cemetery.
Oh.
Yeah. That was another thing. Around 1908, according to the sign that's on the Japanese cemetery, the Japanese wanted a place to bury, and so they actually leased that little plot there for $400 in gold coin. It said, and I guess it was just a one-time payment. So that was it. So that's why the Japanese cemetery is there.
Oh, that's in the triangle, I guess, right at the,
Yeah. Here, go back, Perna. Go back to the map, aerial map, the first map. So,
First one?
yeah, number 3.
This is it?
No, that one. This is the Japanese cemetery right here.
Ah.
This is 2 acres that my dad bought, and this is the Masonic cemetery, and this would be our property here too. Yeah, the ranch, and all this was supposed to be a cemetery at one time, but it never got developed. So there's actually 2 cemeteries there, the Japanese and the Masonic. Okay. Okay, next slide. So this is about the location of the 8th Volunteer Ohio, and all this green field out here. These tree line is where the Confederates were before the battle started. They were sitting in the shade over here, and first of all, they had a cannon battle with the cannons. The Confederate cannons went over here, and the Union cannons went over here, and they went back and forth for a while. And then they came out and they marched across this field, and the 8th Ohio was over here, and they were shooting at them, and the major, the troops behind the stone wall were here shooting at them, and they just got shot up. Couldn't the way they did it in those days, walk out, let somebody shoot you. Next slide. Okay, this is a monument that's for the 8th Infantry, Ohio Infantry, and this is the roadway, and so they were in this area, and this would be where the Confederates were at here. We went and visited, spent a couple of days in Gettysburg. Next slide. Okay, the next person that was buried there was a person by the name of James Young Saviers. And he was born in 1824 in Richland, Ohio. He crossed the plains in 1850 with 10 others and engaged in mining near Hangtown, California for 1 year. He was a wagon maker by trade. In 1853, while out hunting, he was shot by Indians in both shoulders. During that encounter, he received 5 arrows in his body, the head of one he carried to his grave. In 1854, he returned to Ohio by way of the Isthmus of Panama and married Elizabeth Jones in 1855. In 1860, he crossed the plains again as the captain of a wagon train consisting of his family and 60 other souls. He settled this time in Yuba County. His wife died in 1863, and he moved to this area, the Hueneme Plains, in 1869, and actually settled on the property that in 1899 would be the site of the Oxnard Sugar Factory. He was, for 8 years, he was justice of the peace of Hueneme Township, and he's buried in the cemetery, but he's another one that there's no marker, and no one knows where exactly. Yeah, but next slide. There is a monument with the name Saviers on it, but there's no names of who's buried there. Next slide. And in 1918, his grandson had a tragic death. He was crushed. 2 bales of hay fell on him, heavy bales, and crushed his skull. 4 years old. He was the only son of C.W. Saviers, who was J.Y.'s son. So he died and was buried there in 1918. So he might be in that plot. He's another one, there's no name. But 4 years old. Yeah, next slide. Okay, now this is my great-grandfather, and he was born in Germany in 1835. He immigrated from Germany to Texas with his wife and 7 children in 1886, and they immigrated through New York, and they first went to South Texas and were in Texas for 7 years. He got his citizenship papers there in Victoria, Texas, and then they came to Chino, California, because there was a sugar factory that was operating there, and I'm sure that he was attracted to that area because the owner of the Chino Sugar Factory advertised in newspapers throughout the United States that there was land available to rent or buy, and there was a sugar factory there that needed growers to grow sugar beets. So they went to Chino, and also, while he grew up in Germany, I found out just recently that Germany was the largest, is where sugar beet production and refining actually was first being discovered. And there was, Germany in the 1880s was the leading producer of sugar from sugar beets in the world at that time. So, and there was a sugar refinery in the town of Magdeburg, which was close to his hometown. And so I think it was probably something that he was at least a little bit familiar with and probably would gravitate to being, yeah, this could work. Yeah. So he had 5 boys, so he had a workforce, and so they went to Chino and grew sugar beets for that factory. And then they moved up here. Then the farmers from this area went down to Chino and convinced the Oxnard brothers that this Hueneme Plains would be a good place to grow sugar beets because they were already growing lima beans here and barley, and that they would also need a factory up here, so that's what happened. The Oxnard brothers built the factory, but they didn't build it in Hueneme. They built it over in what would be the town of Oxnard because there was plenty of water there, artesian wells. Water just flowed out of the ground. And so my great-grandfather, we discovered, actually had an account here at the Hueneme Bank in 1898. So he didn't buy property here until 1901, but he was in the area. Okay, next slide. Thomas Clark was another pioneer who crossed the Great Plains a number of times, and the first time was 1848, and he returned to Illinois in 1850. 1851, he crossed the plains to Oregon with his mother, brothers, and sister, and his mother and one brother were killed by Indians on the trail. So in 1852, he returned to Illinois, and 1853, with another brother and family, he returned to Oregon, crossing the plains for the 3rd time. And in 1854, he fought in the war with the Rogue River Indians in Oregon, and he came to Ventura County area, which was the new county. It wasn't formed until 1874. It was at one time all this was Santa Barbara County. So he came to this area in 1887 and ended up owning about 1,000 acres around the area called Springville, where there was a small cemetery, and the Masonic Cemetery took over for the Springville Cemetery. 1903, he died of heart failure at the age of 89. 3 times across the wagon, 3 times. I mean, it's bad enough to just do 3 auto trips, you know.
And he lived to be 89.
And he lived to be 89. Next, Clyde Barr, 13 years of age. He was climbing on a picket fence and fell, and the picket stuck him in the hip somehow, and they didn't think it was that serious, but he got lockjaw, and he died. Next slide. This is another tragedy. 2 infants, first of all, the infant dies in 1901 at 4 months old. Okay, the parents have another child, and that child dies in the same month, in December the next year of 1902. So the parents lose 2 infants in 13 months. But, next slide. Here's another child. He drowned in the reservoir, and his father was working for Ed Borcher to help him to irrigate an alfalfa patch 2 miles north of Oxnard, which is where the Borcher family owned property up there about where Gonzales Road is now. The father's children were playing nearby, and of course the water was in an open ditch, and something happened to the water supply. It was diminished, and so Mr. Borcher went to investigate, and he reached his hand down in the water, and he grasped the hand of the little boy who was probably trying to swim in the water and got sucked in by the pressure of the water. ground, 3 years old. Daniel Childers, this was a very gruesome death. He was a taxi driver, and he was transporting, his route was between El Rio and downtown Oxnard, and he got tangled up with a wagon and a team somehow, and he ended up running into the wagon, and the wagon, the tongue of the wagon speared him in the face, and just, this was quoted in the paper. It says, the pole of the wagon went through the windshield and hit Childers in the mouth, tearing away the side of his face. Childers attempted to say something to Chief Murray, but his organs of articulation had been torn away and he could not form a word. And this was a lengthy write-up in the paper, and it was gory. This is only part of it. If you want to read the whole thing, you can get my book and read the whole thing. It talks about blood spurting, and it was just terrible. And it was a bad deal. Okay, next slide. Another death, the gory death, was a guy by the name of Joe Armstrong. He was a teamster for the Hill Ranch, and everybody's probably heard of Hill Street in Oxnard. That was part of the before the sugar factory, and the city of Oxnard. The city of Oxnard was actually built on a lot of acreage that the Hill family owned. Downtown Oxnard was built there, but they still had other land. And in 1901, this teamster had delivered a wagon load of sugar beets to the sugar factory. He was leaving the factory, and he was traveling on Woolley Road, westbound towards the ranch property, which would be over by Oxnard Boulevard. And something spooked his team, and the team whirled around, 8-horse team whirled around and tipped over the wagon, and he was crushed by the wagon. And sorry, I don't have any pleasant deaths. Probably a few heart attacks, died in his sleep. They didn't make the headlines. Okay, the next one. This is very interesting. This is Sarah Elliott, born in Pennsylvania in 1852, and she was trained in medicine, and at the time of the Johnstown flood, do I have that date up there? I don't guess I got it. But it killed 2,000 people. It was a very, everybody's heard about the Johnstown flood. And she went on her own to help the victims. And Clara Barton was there. She was the founder of the Red Cross. And they met, and Clara Barton signed her up as a member of the Red Cross. And so she stayed in Johnstown for 6 months, working day and night, making a Herculean effort to bring order and comfort to the victims. And she had a brother and a sister that lived out here in Oxnard. So in 1908, she's out here, and she just dies suddenly. And so she's also buried in the Masonic Cemetery, and another unmarked grave. So this is the present owner of the cemetery. This is Roberto Garcia, who's the local mortician in town, and he purchased the cemetery And he has cleaned it up, and it's very presentable now. And this is his father, who's in his 90s. And he is a stud. This guy, I mean, he's out there working with a shovel, and you know, it's just unbelievable. He's just strong person. And these are other helpers. And we can go to the next slide. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. See, so that they shoveled all the dirt. This is the concrete markers that I talked about earlier, and the borders. You can see each one's about 20 by 20, and here's on this side there's another 20 by 20, and you can see how loose and sandy that soil is, and that was one of the reasons that this site was chosen, because sand is, you know, a well-drained soil, so it wouldn't become a quagmire and flood in the wintertime. And so he cleaned it all up, and he has plans of, at least he's told me that he hopes to be able to bury people there again someday, but not actually, he wants to have bury ashes and have a mausoleum, and of course make better use of the land. So,
He says a green burial and tree pot.
yeah. What's a tree plot?
Tree pot where your ashes are put into a pot and a tree grows from it.
Oh, okay.
They're looking to get in the water.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope he's successful. Next slide. This is just more of a panorama of the cemetery. Pleasant Valley Road is over here. Next. I think this is the Saviors monument over here. Next. So, in conclusion, that's what I know about the Hueneme Masonic Cemetery and some of the pioneers that were interred there many years ago. And the moral of the story is, next slide. The moral of the story is lifetimes end at the cemetery, but the stories live on until the end of time. Okay, wake up, Bob.
Frank,
Frank, you are not boring, but the medications he takes